I remember growing up as a young child, had relatives that were in the ministry preaching the gospel. It really saddens me that I had a lot of family members that knew who Jesus was, but they never told me who he was. Back then, the big thing was you need to get in church. So I grew up thinking if I got in church, then I'll be all right. But that wasn't true. Going to church doesn't fix a man. I remember in my early 20s watching a preacher on TV. I think I was already seeking God. I've always believed in God. I just didn't know who he was. I remember laying on my couch, drinking my beer, watching the preacher on TV. What he was saying was making a lot of sense, but I found myself just making fun of him, taking my beer cans and throwing them at the TV, and finally just falling asleep, not knowing what he was talking about. So my first trip to church was to a small church in Montgomery, Alabama. I thought, if this is God, I don't think I want him. But the next week I went to church and I was introduced to the pastor of the church afterward. This is the same preacher I watched on TV making fun of. I think the first thing he asked me was, "Are you a follower of Christ?" I said, "Sure." I went home knowing that I just lied to the preacher. It bothered me all afternoon. All this time I was just going, I don't really know who God is. Do you just go to church? What is this life? Because no one had actually shared the gospel of Christ with me. Even when I went to church, I didn't hear the gospel. That night I went back, and for the first time in my life, I heard the gospel through a song called "Love Grew Where the Blood Fell." This is where I discovered who Jesus Christ was. The first verse of the song, the choir was singing it, says, "See my Jesus on the cross," the people crying. Looking on, a man would think that it was tragedy, but what the world couldn't see was when they nailed him to the tree, it would break the chains of sin's captivity. There's the gospel. The song continues, "Love grew where the blood fell. Flowers of hope sprang up for men in misery. Sin died." There's the gospel. Sin died where the blood fell. I'm so glad this precious blood has covered me. I remember that song pulling my heart toward Christ. Thorns of violence and hate were growing wildly, and the pain that they had caused was plain to see. But what the world couldn't see was when they nailed him to the tree, it would break the chains of sin's captivity. I remember overflowing power of God coming and helping me see the truth about who Jesus was. I responded to the gospel call and gave my life to Christ. It's been over 40 years. My story now is part of his story. Jesus' own words describing himself. No man's coming to the Father unless they come through me. Thank God I was able to come to the Father through the sacrifice of Christ on that cross. The power of Christ broke the chains of sin's captivity in my life and literally set me free from sin.